Frank was 71 years old, a decorated veteran who had spent most of his life in uniform. Now, he was in a wheelchair, his body bearing the scars of battles long past. One leg lost in a foreign war, his back crooked from shrapnel that had nearly ended his life decades ago. His cap rested low on his head, stitched with faded words, U.S. Navy veteran. Frank wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. He came here most afternoons for a quiet lunch and a cup of black coffee. The cafe owner, a kind woman named Carol, always kept his seat by the window ready for him. Frank would smile, thank her, and then sit silently, staring out at the world he had once fought to protect. The bell above the door jingled. Then again, and again, one by one, the bikers poured in, heavy boots stomping across the linoleum floor. The cafe went quiet. Conversations died in half-formed sentences. Forks hovered above plates. The group was loud, laughing, leather jackets creaking as they moved. And then their leader spotted Frank. The man was tall, broad, his beard tangled, sunglasses still covering his eyes, even in the dim light of the cafe. His gaze fixed on Frank's cap, and a sneer twisted his mouth. Well, the biker leader said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Look what we've got here. Old Glory himself. A real war hero. The men around him chuckled, low and mean. They spread out, circling, their presence choking the room. Frank looked up calmly, his eyes steady though his hands trembled faintly against the table. He didn't respond. Don't ignore me, old man, the leader growled, stepping closer. You think that hat makes you special? You think your wars make you better than us? Carol hurried forward, her apron trembling in her hands. Please, leave him be. He's just... Quiet, the biker snapped. His hand shot out, knocking the coffee cup from Frank's table. It crashed against the floor, shattering into pieces, hot liquid splattering across the tiles. The room gasped. Frank didn't flinch. He simply sat, silent, his jaw tightening. The leader leaned in closer, his breath heavy with alcohol. Maybe it's time somebody taught you a lesson. And then, just like that, the bikers struck. The cafe erupted into chaos. And yet, none of them could have imagined what was coming next. Because 10 minutes later, the Navy SEALs showed up. The cafe wasn't built for violence. It was a quiet refuge where truckers stopped for pancakes, families came for Sunday brunch, and retirees lingered over pie. But when the first punch landed, the entire room froze. The biker leader's fist connected with Frank's jaw, sending his cap tumbling to the ground. The old veteran's head snapped to the side, but he didn't cry out. He just sat there, bracing against the pain. His wheelchair rattled as another biker shoved him back, pinning him against the wall. Carol screamed. A young couple in the corner rose halfway, then sank back down, terrified. Nobody wanted to be the one to intervene. These bikers had a reputation. They didn't just scare people, they owned fear. Get up, soldier, one of them mocked, kicking at the footrest of Frank's chair. The metal clanged, echoing too loud in the small room. Oh, wait, you can't. The laughter that followed was cruel, sharp, and hollow. Frank spat blood onto the floor. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, almost haunting. You boys have no idea what you're doing. That should have been the warning. But arrogance drowned out reason. The leader leaned closer, grabbing the veteran by the collar of his shirt. What are you going to do, old man? Call your army? Those days are gone. Nobody's coming for you. Frank's eyes flickered, something unreadable behind them. It wasn't fear. It was memory, flashes of battlefields, the roar of helicopters, the silence of friends who never made it home. And then, quietly, he answered, They always come. The bikers roared with laughter. They didn't notice the two men at a corner booth who had gone silent. They didn't notice the third man near the back, setting down his fork and pushing his plate away. They didn't notice the sharp glance shared between them. Because those three weren't ordinary customers. They were men who still carried themselves with precision, with discipline. Broad shoulders under civilian clothes, eyes that scanned exits and entrances out of habit, posture that never fully relaxed. They had served under Frank. And more than that, they were Navy SEALs. The three had come to town on leave, passing through, stopping for a late lunch. They hadn't expected to see their former chief, and they certainly hadn't expected to see him attacked. But now, as Frank's blood dripped onto the floor tiles, something inside them snapped into place. Their leader had taught them everything they knew about loyalty, courage, and never leaving a man behind. And they weren't about to start now. The bikers, drunk on their own power, thought they owned the room. They had no idea death itself was sitting 3 tables away, waiting for the right moment to stand. Outside, the sun was still shining, casting cheerful beams through the cafe windows. Inside, the storm was building, and in less than 10 minutes, the Navy SEALs were going to make sure these bikers remembered the meaning of fear. The biker leader straightened, still gripping Frank by the collar. His leather vest creaked as he pulled the old man forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "See this? This is what your country left you with. A broken old cripple." He shoved Frank back into the chair hard. The wheelchair slammed against the wall. Frank grimaced, but didn't make a sound. His silence only angered them more. Carol pleaded again, her voice breaking. "Please, leave him alone." The bikers ignored her. One of them, a younger man with tattoos crawling up his neck, snatched Frank's cap from the floor and twirled it on his finger. U.S. Navy veteran, he read aloud, mocking every word. "Big man, huh? I bet you used to bark orders. Now you just sit." The group howled with laughter, their boots stomping on the floor. For the diners huddled in their booths, it felt like the walls themselves were shrinking inward. And then the air shifted. The first to move was a man in a plain gray t-shirt at the back booth. He stood slowly, deliberately, like a predator stretching after sleep. His gaze locked on the bikers, and though he said nothing, his presence alone changed the entire temperature of the room. The second man pushed his chair back with calm precision, sliding to his feet. His eyes, cold and sharp, swept across the room, calculating. The third, nearest to the counter, simply rolled his shoulders and stood, finishing his glass of water before setting it gently on the table. The bikers barely noticed at first, but the other customers did. Heads turned, breaths held. Something about the way these 3 men stood, silent, balanced, steady, was unmistakable. The leader frowned. He finally noticed a change. His hand froze on Frank's collar. "You got a problem?" he barked at the man in the gray shirt. The SEAL didn't answer. He just took a single step forward. The biker holding Frank's cap laughed nervously, tossing it back on the floor. "Hey, sit back down. This ain't your business." But the 3 men kept moving, slow and steady, like a tide rolling in. No words, no wasted motion. Frank finally lifted his head. Blood trickled from his lip, but when he saw them, his eyes softened. Recognition, relief, almost pride. The leader barked again, louder this time, as if trying to convince himself he was still in control. "I said sit down." But in that moment, everyone in the cafe felt it. The balance had shifted. The bikers had walked into their own trap, and they didn't even know it yet. 10 minutes ago, they thought they owned the room. Now, 3 silent shadows were closing in, Navy SEALs who had fought, bled, and survived under the very man they were mocking. And the bikers were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The cafe had gone dead silent, except for the steady thump of the bikers' boots and the faint rattle of Frank's wheelchair. Every eye was locked on the 3 strangers advancing from their corners of the room. The leader's grin faltered. He didn't like it. These men weren't puffing up their chests, shouting, or posturing like any normal hothead would. They moved like they'd been here before, like every inch of the cafe had already been measured, every exit noted, every thread accounted for. He jabbed a finger at them. "Back off. This is between us and the old man." The SEAL in the gray shirt finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "It's between us now." The biker's smirk snapped back. "Big talk." He shoved Frank again, harder, try to show dominance. The veteran's chair rocked, dangerously close to tipping. "What are you going to do about it?" He never finished the sentence. The SEAL closest to him moved first, a blur of precision. One hand clamped around the biker's wrist, twisting it in a controlled lock. The other hand struck open palm to the chest, swift, efficient, devastating. The biker stumbled back, gasping for air, his body slamming into a table that crashed under his weight. The cafe erupted into shouts. Two other bikers lunged forward, swinging wild fists. The second seal caught the first punch mid-air, redirecting the force into the attacker's own momentum. A sharp elbow, a sweep of the leg. Down he went, crashing onto the tiles. The second biker barely had time to raise his arms before the third seal's shoulder drove into his ribs, slamming him into the jukebox. The machine shrieked, lights flickering, before falling silent again. The remaining bikers froze. For the first time, doubt rippled through their sneers. The leader roared, dragging a knife from his belt. "You think you can take us?" He slashed the blade through the air, forcing customers to scatter back into booths. The seals didn't flinch. They spread slightly, a silent triangle, eyes locked, bodies fluid and ready. No wasted words, no wasted energy. "Bad choice," the man in the gray shirt said quietly. The leader lunged. The knife sliced forward, but the seal pivoted, sidestepping with lethal grace. His hand snapped out, seizing the biker's wrist, twisting the blade downward. The leader screamed as the weapon clattered across the floor, skidding under a booth. A knee to the gut folded him. A final shove sent him sprawling to the ground. Carol gasped from behind the counter, tears of relief filling her eyes. The cafe's customers, still frozen in disbelief, began to realize what was happening. The nightmare was being dismantled before their eyes. And through it all, Frank sat watching, blood on his lip, pride glowing in his tired eyes. These weren't just random men stepping in. These were his men, his brothers. The bikers had wanted a fight. They had found war. The cafe floor was a wreck of overturned tables and shattered plates. The leader groaned on the ground, clutching his ribs, while two of his men writhed nearby. For a flicker of a moment, it seemed like the fight was already over. But then the rest of the pack surged. 6 bikers still stood, and fury replaced the smug laughter on their faces. Chairs scraped back as they rushed forward in a wave of leather and fists. Their boots thundered against the tiles, a stampede of chaos meant to crush the 3 men who dared defy them. The diners ducked under tables. Carol shielded her face behind the counter. Only Frank remained still, watching with a quiet intensity. He knew what was about to happen. The seals didn't retreat. They didn't hesitate. They closed ranks, shoulders angled, forming a line as natural as breathing. The first biker charged with a roar, swinging wild. A seal parried with forearm and fist, countering with 2 brutal strikes, one to the gut, one to the jaw. The man folded, collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. Another lunge from the side. The second seal spun, catching his momentum and redirecting it into the edge of a booth. Wood cracked, the biker crumpled. 2 came at once. The third seal ducked beneath a swing, rising with an elbow that split lip and sent teeth flying. He pivoted, kneeing the second hard in the thigh, dropping him like a sack of bricks. But the bikers didn't stop. Rage made them reckless, and reckless men are dangerous. One grabbed a chair, swinging it high. Another shattered a beer bottle against the table, glass flashing in the sunlight. The seals adjusted. Calm, precise, every movement efficient. The chair came down. A forearm blocked, a fist followed. The biker hit the floor. The bottle slashed forward. A wrist was seized, twisted, the shard tumbling harmlessly away. A knee to the sternum ended the fight before it began. Seconds felt like hours. Then the room fell into stunned silence. 7 bikers were on the ground, groaning, cursing, or unconscious. Their leader staggered back to his feet, face pale, fury mixing with fear. He stared at the men standing before him. Not just men, but warriors, united and unshaken. "You," he rasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "You don't know who we are." The seal in the gray shirt stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "No, you don't know who he is." He nodded toward Frank, who sat watching from his wheelchair, his chest rising and falling with quiet pride. The bikers finally looked at him differently. For the first time, their sneers cracked into something else, doubt. They had tried to humiliate an old man. Instead, They had awakened his family, and the storm was far from finished. The cafe looked like a battlefield. Chairs overturned, tables splintered, glass and coffee pooled on the floor. The smell of sweat and blood hung in the air. Groans came from the ground where bikers writhed, clutching broken noses and bruised ribs. But it wasn't over. The leader, still standing despite the punishment, staggered toward the counter. His eyes blazed with desperation, not just rage. For him, this was no longer about dominance. It was about pride, about proving to his gang, and maybe himself, that he was still in control. He reached behind his vest. Carol screamed, "He's got a gun." The room froze. The black pistol gleamed under the fluorescent lights, steady in his trembling hands. The SEALs shifted instantly, their posture transforming. No more restraint. This was life and death. The leader's voice cracked with venom. "Nobody moves. Not one damn step." He swung the weapon toward Frank, who sat still, calm, a faint smile on his lips. This is your fault. You think you're untouchable because of your past. You think your little army makes you safe." Frank didn't blink. His voice was steady, firm, carrying weight that silenced even the groaning bikers on the floor. "My past is the reason you're still alive right now. Don't test my men." The SEALs moved slightly, fanning out, trying to angle themselves without drawing attention. Years of training flowed like instinct. One step at a time, subtle, invisible to the untrained eye. But the leader noticed. His hand shook as he waved the gun at them. "Stay back. I'll shoot him. I swear I will." The cafe silence was suffocating. Even the jukebox, knocked half dead earlier, seemed to hold its breath. The SEAL in the gray shirt spoke softly, his tone calm, but cutting through the tension. "Put it down. You're scared. You don't want to do this." "Shut up," the leader roared, spittle flying from his lips. His finger twitched dangerously close to the trigger. Time slowed. The SEALs' minds raced. Distance, 15 feet. Angle bad. Civilians, everywhere. Risk too high. But hesitation was a death sentence. The leader took a step closer to Frank. "Say goodbye, old man." That was the mistake. The third SEAL, positioned closest, moved like lightning. A blur. He grabbed a plate from the counter and hurled it with pinpoint accuracy. The dish shattered against the biker's wrist, the shock knocking his aim wide. The gun fired, boom, the shot tearing into the ceiling, raining plaster dust across the cafe. The leader recoiled, stunned. That was all the opening they needed. The gray-shirt SEAL lunged, closing the distance in 3 strides. His hand clamped on the pistol, twisting hard, breaking the man's grip with brutal precision. The weapon clattered to the floor. In the same motion, his knee slammed into the biker's midsection, folding him like paper. The second SEAL followed with a crushing elbow to the side of the head. The leader crumpled to the ground, groaning. The fight finally ripped from his body. Silence returned, thick, suffocating, absolute. Carol collapsed behind the counter, sobbing in relief. The young couple clutched each other in the booth, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Even the bikers who could still move lay flat, hands raised, their bravado shattered. The SEAL in the gray shirt picked up the pistol, dropped the magazine, and cleared the chamber with practiced ease. He set the weapon on the counter, far from reach. Then he turned to Frank. "You all right, Chief?" Frank's eyes glistened. His jaw trembled, but not from pain. He looked at each of them in turn. Their faces older now, weathered by years of service, but still the men he had trained, mentored, fought beside. "You came," Frank whispered. The SEALs exchanged a glance, a silent bond sparking between them. Their leader finally answered, "We never left." Outside, the sound of distant sirens began to rise, the echo of local law enforcement rushing toward the chaos. But inside the cafe, time stood still. Customers began to stir, whispering, their fear dissolving into awe. The bikers, once a terror, were nothing but broken remnants on the floor. And the old veteran, bloodied but unbroken, sat taller in his wheelchair than any of them had ever stood. The storm had ended, but the lesson was only beginning, because what had just happened wasn't just about fists, knives, or bullets. It was about honor, loyalty, and a bond forged in the fire of war. And as the SEALs stood beside their chief, shielding him as they always had, the entire cafe understood one truth. You don't disrespect a man who gave his life for his brothers. And you never, ever raise your hand against family. The wail of sirens grew louder, rolling down Main Street like a tide. Red and blue lights flickered against the cafe's dusty windows, painting the room in urgent colors. Outside, tires screeched as squad cars brake hard, doors swinging open, officers pouring out. Inside, the cafe was silent but heavy with the aftermath. The bikers, once snarling, loud, and arrogant, now lay scattered across the floor like discarded dolls. Some groaned, others whimpered, but none dared move. The fight had been beaten out of them in minutes, not by numbers, but by precision, discipline, and unshakable loyalty. The SEALs stood in formation near Frank's table, their presence commanding even in civilian clothes. One of them still held the pistol's empty magazine in his hand. Another wiped blood from his knuckles with a napkin. Their breathing was steady, calm, as though their bodies had already filed the fight away as another mission completed. Frank sat in the middle of it all, blood on his lip, his uniform cap back in his lap. His wheelchair was dented, his shirt torn, but his eyes burned with life. For the first time in years, he looked taller than the men towering above him. The cafe's door slammed open. "Hands where I can see them," a police sergeant barked, weapon raised. Behind him, half a dozen officers stormed in, eyes darting across the wreckage. They froze at the sight. Bikers broken on the floor, civilians huddled behind counters, and 3 men standing like statues beside an old veteran. Carol stumbled out from behind the counter, apron soaked with tears. "Officers, no. You don't understand. They saved us." The sergeant blinked, confused. His gaze swept the scene again, and the picture became clearer. The bikers, infamous in this town, were on the ground. The cafe patrons, though shaken, nodded frantically, pointing to the SEALs with gratitude, not fear. One officer cuffed the gang leader, who groaned as his arms were yanked behind his back. "You'll pay for this," the biker hissed weakly, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Another officer helped drag the unconscious ones out, their boots leaving streaks across the tiles. For the first time in months, maybe years, Main Street would breathe easy without their shadow. The sergeant lowered his weapon, his jaw set. He gave the SEALs a long, measured look. "I don't know who you are," he said, voice rough, "but it looks like this town owes you." The man in the gray shirt gave a faint smile, but he shook his head. "Don't thank us. Thank him." He stepped aside, and all eyes turned to Frank. The old veteran sat silently for a moment, his weathered hands gripping the cap in his lap. He looked around the cafe, the broken tables, the frightened faces, the bikers being dragged out in chains. Then he lifted his gaze to the SEALs. "I told them," Frank said softly, his voice carrying through the quiet. "I told them you'd come." The words hit the room like a hammer, not loud, but unshakable. Carol's breath caught. The young couple in the booth exchanged a glance, tears welling in their eyes. Even the sergeant shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of something larger than law and order. The SEALs looked at one another, their hardened expressions softening. They didn't speak because there was nothing left to say. Frank wasn't just a veteran to them. He was their chief, their mentor, their family. One of them finally broke the silence. "We wouldn't be here without you. We never forget who taught us what brotherhood means." Frank's hand trembled as he set his cap back on his head. He straightened in his chair, and though his body was broken, his spirit towered over every man in that room. "You boys did good," he said, pride thick in his tone. "Just like always." Outside, the last of the bikers were loaded into squad cars. The flashing lights dimmed as the convoy pulled away, sirens fading into the distance. The cafe began to breathe again. Civilians emerged from hiding places, murmurs of disbelief and relief filling the air. Some approached Frank, shaking his hand, whispering thank yous with trembling voices. Carol knelt by his side, tears still glistening. "You're safe now, Frank. Because of them." Frank's eyes softened. "Because of all of us." Nobody stands alone. Not then, not now. The SEALs gathered their things, ready to leave before the attention grew heavier. But as they turned to the door, Frank called out, "Wait!" They stopped. Frank lifted his hand in a small, imperfect salute. His arm shook, but the gesture was flawless in its meaning. The SEALs froze, then returned the salute with precision, their movements sharp, crisp, unified. For a heartbeat, the cafe became something else. Not a diner on Main Street, not a battlefield, but a sacred ground where respect and loyalty stood unbroken. When their hands lowered, none of the onlookers could speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The SEAL in the gray shirt gave Frank a final nod. "We'll see you again, Chief." Frank smiled faintly, his voice a whisper now. "I'll be here." The door opened, sunlight pouring in, and the SEALs stepped out into the bright afternoon. Their shadows stretched long across the pavement as they disappeared into the world, leaving the cafe changed forever. Frank sat quietly, his chest heaving with the weight of memory and pride. For years he had wondered if the world had moved on without him, if the sacrifices of men like him had faded into dust. But today, as the sunlight warmed his scarred hands and the sound of engines faded into silence, he knew the truth. They hadn't forgotten. They never would. And neither would anyone in that cafe.